If only life were a straight path to our desired destination, wouldn't life be so much easier? Yeah, maybe. But those unexpected zigzags in our path teach us that life's tough struggles have greater purpose than we ever imagined. Stories and strategies are our focus for Season 4. Zigzag and One host, Melanie Brown, chats with courageous women who share their stories of encountering zigzags and how they fought to overcome them. Be assured their stories will inspire and encourage you. But we know warm and fuzzy feelings aren't enough to equip you to fight those challenging zigzags in your path. So, this season, our guests are joining us for another episode to share strategies, mindsets, and habits that strengthened and empowered them during their toughest seasons. Join us in declaring, zigzags may interrupt our path, but they will not detour us. We will keep moving forward.
Welcome to another episode of the Zigzag and One podcast. Thanks for joining me. In our last episode, episode 58, my guest Tami O'Connor shared about her daughter Jordyn's cancer diagnosis and how she found her even if he does not faith when Jordyn did not experience an earthly physical healing. Jordyn passed away just a little over a year ago. Tami continues to grieve Jordyn's passing, but she gives glory to God for filling her with an unexplainable joy. Tami joins me again today to share a deeper understanding that she's gained about how a seed that dies produces a plentiful harvest. Yes, you heard me right. She believes the seed, Jordyn, dying has already started producing a plentiful harvest. And she's excited to see the next harvest and the next and the next that Jordyn's passing will produce in her life and the lives of countless others. I'm excited for you to hear her wisdom and her heart. Please join my conversation with Tami O'Connor. Welcome back, Tami.
Thank you for having me.
This is what I've learned about you in the short time that I've known you. This episode is supposed to be strategies, habits, and mindset. But what you want to talk about in this episode does not fit in that box. And I'm learning that that's just who you are.
Yes.
From one out-of-the-box person to another.
Uh-huh.
I love that. We're going to do, instead of strategy, habit, and mindset, we're going to do a deeper understanding that you experienced during your time over the last few years as you journeyed through some major zigzags.
Yes.
And for those of you who haven't listened to her story, make sure that you go back and listen to the previous episode so that you understand where this deeper understanding comes from. It's deep-rooted, and that's why we're calling it a deep understanding. Let's talk about that deep understanding and how you progressed to it.
Okay, so basically, I found a deep understanding through a foundation of a lot of study, spending a lot of time with God and journaling and really facing who I am in Him. And that has been like the foundation and principles of how I live my life. But during the zigzags of losing my daughter, one of the things that I struggled with was facing the why of
Sure,
of
course.
I mean, obviously, we experienced beautiful miracles, but still, you're wrecked with the why. And I find that so many people are struggling with that who have lost loved ones. And God so sweetly revealed to me some of His truth when I was reading this beautiful article about a missionary who had lost his wife. And at the end, they put the scripture, and it spoke deeply into my soul. It's from John 12:24, and it says, "I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat is planted in the soil and dies, it remains alone. But its death will produce many new kernels, a plentiful harvest of new lives." And as soon as I read that, I knew that the Lord was telling me that that's why, and that she was his first, and that she was not created for me, but that she was created for him and for his greater plan, and that he was going to use her life and this story, and through my journey, my faith journey, of even if he does not faith, that he's going to produce a harvest.
That verse, of course, we know what seed and harvest means in the agricultural sense.
Right.
We've seen it as a kid, as an adult. My dad had a garden when I was a child, and I remember helping him plant the seeds and anticipating all the different steps of that process. But when you relate it to your situation and the loss of your daughter and how that becomes a harvest, it changes the meaning.
Yes.
And I believe that the meaning that you garnered from that is equally as applicable as what we might see in somebody's garden. But it changes the meaning completely.
Yes.
What is that deep understanding of that verse of the seed dying and producing a harvest? What did God reveal to you?
Well, it just changed the trajectory of who, when I was questioning the why, it just changed that to an understanding of that we each have a harvest that is being produced in our lives for the glory of God.
Yes.
And when we don't walk in that plan and that purpose, then we're basically we're spoiling the harvest. Like we're basically, cutting it before it's
ready.
produced the fruit.
I'm wondering if we can go back and let's talk about the whole planting a seed and the process to harvest. I know it may feel a little bit off base, but maybe you will indulge me a minute.
No, it's fine.
So I'm thinking back to when I was teaching, and I had a teacher I taught with that beautifully did science. Science is not my favorite subject, but she did a beautiful job and illustrated often how it related to God's plan. So I'm thinking of what I learned by listening to her teach the students. And so the first thing that happens is we have a seed.
Right.
And within that seed, we have purpose.
Of course.
And it's not revealed, it's hidden because of the seed coat.
Right.
In order for that purpose to be revealed, it has to be planted in the dirt, and it's hidden.
Right.
And one of the times that I remember her teaching, she spent a good amount of time saying that you will be hidden.
Yeah.
You will be in the dark, and it will be a struggle. And there is a struggle that happens when the seed coat is broken open.
Right.
As you mentioned in that verse, that in order for that seed coat to be broken, it has to die.
Right.
Right. And then over time, and I want us to talk about that in a moment, over time, it's growing and making a fruit or
it's making something.
it's making
it's fulfilling its purpose.
It's growing over that period of time, and as that growth happens, then at some point there will be some flower or fruit,
right,
or such, and it's a process. And
That's
I think
where
sometimes that process is where we get hung up, is that we feel like, good gracious, how long do we have to grow? And how many times do we have to be pruned if you're a fruit tree? How many times do you have to be pruned before you actually produce fruit? And I remember coming across a quote that said, the very last thing to reveal itself is the fruit.
Yes.
And it's
so beautiful.
it's beautiful, but it's hard.
That's so hard.
It's so hard because it's a process, and the fruit is, of course, the harvest.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about how that applies to your daughter as far as her death, then producing at some point a harvest. What do you envision? What do you see?
I feel like what I see is a multiplication. So,
yes. And God promises that
yes.
from day one.
Yes. Obviously, her story, people followed her story for 2 years straight. And then they've followed the story on even into her passing. They followed the story through our grieving. I've been vulnerable and transparent to a lot of people. I've been sharing my heart and my grieving journey through the process. It has spoke to other people. It's helped other people walk through grief and healing, and helped other people find their joy in the midst of their own suffering. And so I think individually and collectively, we're all creating harvests that are multiplying, and each person that has come encounter with that, I think, finds their own harvest, and then they in turn multiply as well.
And it's this collective impacting others.
Yes.
Through her life.
Correct.
Going back to the interview where we talked about your story, she had some struggles before the cancer diagnosis, and those things were resolved to a certain degree.
Correct.
Before she passed.
Mm-hmm.
Those also, because people knew about those struggles that she had and how she came back to the Lord, can also produce a harvest.
Absolutely.
So what I'm seeing from hearing your story and loving the idea of how we are part of that process.
Yes.
You know, it's easy to look at a plant and go, oh, I know what happens. And you can go through the steps and you can talk about the fruit at the end and all of that. But God does tell us, be fruitful and multiply.
Absolutely.
And you can't be fruitful and multiply without going through what He has put into place of the seed and then the harvest.
Correct.
And I think that it is a great conversation for us to have and to explore further of how that applies to our faith walk.
Mm-hmm.
How did that apply for you as far as your journey of faith, the even if faith, and how there was a seed that had to be broken, and then there was a time period of growth. There was some pruning. There
Absolutely.
was some fire.
Absolutely.
As you said in the last interview.
Yes.
But then the harvest that you are seeing, and I know you mentioned some of that, but you have a nonprofit. And so there can be a harvest there.
Correct.
It can be a harvest in people that come to you and say, I've just lost my spouse. How that harvest can then apply to those relationships.
Well, I find that in the quiet times that I am obviously watering and feeding the seed, if you will.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
And it is producing a growth in me through this journey. And I feel like this season is that time for me to grow in the understanding of what kind of fruit is going to be produced through this process. So far, it's produced a lot of joy, even when it didn't make any sense. And I think that that's what draws the brokenhearted inward to that, is that they see something that doesn't make sense.
Absolutely. Because then you think, how is that even possible? And when they approach you and ask you about it, you have no other choice but to point to God, because there is no other explanation
Absolutely.
For your joy.
And even strong believers who are like, they can't reconcile what I'm talking about, and they should be able to because they're believers,
Right.
and they should be able to draw that same kind of joy. But when you're talking about losing a child, it doesn't make sense to people that the providence of God would take a child from its mother. So it causes their own
questioning.
Yes, of how would they experience, or how would they be dealing with this? Or they always, how are you not in the fetal position? How are you here today? How are you functioning? I think that that's just a true testament to already the fruit that's being produced from this harvest.
But let's be honest. I know from the Facebook post that I've read since being in contact with you, you have had days where you've
so
struggled
many
to get out of bed.
Yes.
Where you've been in that ball on the floor. Is that okay?
100%. In fact, I feel like it is the way to do it, is to walk through the grieving process and letting it all play out. I feel like it's that whole running into the fire thing.
Yes.
And so some days I choose to just let it all just overwhelm me and consume me, because that's where I start to really feel the deepest parts of who I am and who God wants me to be. And when I'm vulnerable with him, that's when he refines me.
I would have to think on those days, I can't even walk in your shoes of grief because I have not experienced that. It would be hard to give into it because you know how painful it's going to be. You're likely not remembering the joyous moments of your relationship with Jordyn. You're bringing back all the tough times and even maybe thinking forward in the future of not having her at certain
monumental moments.
Monumental moments. As you said, going into it, that deeper understanding of God.
Yes.
Because he would be teaching you there.
Yes.
Things that would help in your healing, not physical healing.
No.
But spiritual, emotional healing. Almost like counseling. When you go to a counseling appointment, you know you're walking into pain. It's not like, oh, we're going to celebrate how wonderful you are. No, it's going to be awful. You're going to likely cry and be angry and all of those things. But you can't get to that healing until you have those times. I guess I'm thinking that is to be true for those days that you are vulnerable enough to share on Facebook that you are having those times. Wherein some people would say, well, you know, she's still grieving.
I'm always going to be grieving.
You're always going to be grieving. But what you're revealing in those posts that I think is so helpful and valuable to other people is to see that grief is very real and it's very heavy. But God is with you there.
Always.
It's not like he said, well, I was with you when it happened.
Right.
And now you're on your own.
Yeah.
He says, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. What is he teaching you about life and death? And what is he teaching you about life and death?
Oh, that's a deep question. I feel like it goes right back to the harvest, which is why it's made such an impact on me, is that he produced us into this realm, if you will, and he grows us in this place. This is where he's planting our seeds. We're dying to self. It goes back to the surrender.
Yes.
And then when we die to self, we start to grow, and then we get the fruit at the end. And then the same cycle happens in the process of the death. And I find it fascinating that the two times that we can really encounter behind the veil the most is at birth and death. That's and so
interesting.
Yeah. So I just feel like those two are like bookends to the harvest.
And so is death something that you have come to terms with your daughter, of course? How has that changed your viewpoint?
I have absolutely no fear of death whatsoever.
Why is that?
Well, one, because God gave me a glimpse during the week that she was passing. He gave me a glimpse of what's behind the veil.
Yes.
So, and really, to be honest, our whole family is just jealous and can't wait to get there to be with her, and him, of course.
Right.
I don't know. There's just no fear. It's so peaceful, and all of his truths have become so active and alive and real. They're no longer cliche or churchy, religious.
You've seen them happen.
Yeah.
You've seen the outcome of it.
I've had full encounters. I've collided with the supernatural. And so it just none of the fears that I had or the questions I had have any bearing anymore.
Well said. I haven't had the opportunity to come to a situation where I have to run into the fire and face that. My father-in-law passed about six years ago. And as far as very close family members, that would be him. And while I've grieved for him, like you, I do have a glimpse of I know where he is.
Right.
And I know he is having a blast.
Mm-hmm.
I miss him, but I also know he's in a great place. And
they're more alive than we are here.
yes.
Yeah.
And that seems so
crazy,
counterintuitive
right?
to what it should be.
Right.
When we talk about the whole seed and planting and dying and then growing, let's hit on the growing part for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
That can be painful too.
Yes.
How have you seen the growing part be painful?
Well, I spend a lot of time wrestling with God because I'm grieving. So I go through all the natural stages of anger and emotion and sadness and bouts of depression or the why or pity. There's so many emotions that you walk through or really lay through because I feel like you just want to lay around and, woe is me. It's a beckoning. I feel like there's a drawing of my spirit that just keeps getting pulled back into the truth. And it really is more like a warfare. And the truth overrides the warfare. And I feel like that's where that foundation has carried me through. Whereas if you don't have that foundation, I can see where the enemy would have a stronghold on you and you would easily succumb to the lack of joy and the lack of drive to push forward and to be a part of something bigger.
The idea of the spiritual warfare occurring during growth is knocking me on my feet, off my feet, because I've never thought about that. But it does happen during growth. I recently had an encounter with some spiritual warfare. And like you, the foundation of God's word was the thing that kept me from being destroyed.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I'm envisioning in my mind a plant growing, and I'm seeing the warfare, and it's not a one-to-one, but think about the different weather elements and
of course
those things attacking during that growth.
Like a tornado.
Like a tornado! Super heavy winds that's going to sway you. I think about the tree that's bent, where the wind, as it was growing, made it bend over to one direction or another. But yet it prevailed. The tree continued to grow.
Those with deep roots.
Those are my favorite trees. I love those trees with deep roots. But then you think about the different animals or rodents that are attacking, and I'm seeing in my head, I'm seeing all of those as spiritual warfare attacks.
Yes, the lies.
During a growing season, if we relate that back to your grieving and your loss, the enemy would want nothing more than to steal your joy.
Absolutely.
And because of that prevailing, that demonstrates God's supernatural work in your life. Even more so, it wouldn't be there if God were not supporting you and his presence near you. My mind is going in 100 directions because I'm seeing all kinds of different examples of how this plays out.
Yes.
It is a beautiful example of God and how he works in our lives.
It was interesting. I had a conversation with Jordyn during the 4 months that she was at our home, and we talked about the sadness that we feel over like family members who grieve so deeply that they end up falling victim to addiction or agoraphobia. Like they don't want to, they just feel like all consumed by grief. And she was like, I can't have that be my family. I need my life to be honored and to like not have everybody, be consumed by it. And she was like, that's not what I would want. And I remember our whole family, when she was in the passing process, we all sat with her and talked to her, even though she wasn't necessarily responding in a full engaged conversation. We all pretty much made this promise, if you will, like this conversation that we would honor her by being adventurous and living our lives boldly and having purpose, because hers was short and she, was the one in our lives that always brought all that joy and free spirit and venture. Yeah. So we were just like, we're going to find our way to do that. And you cannot do that you can't do that if you're in a place of constant grief and sadness and depression. And so it's something I feel like she's just kind of pushing me forward as well, in that I know it will honor her and glorify God all at the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There could not be a more beautiful way to end this show with what you said and the tagline for this podcast. You just summarized the tagline, which says, when life zigs and zags, and of course, yours definitely has, keep moving forward.
Absolutely.
You're doing that in honor of your daughter.
Yes.
Just beautiful, Tami.
Thank you. Thank you.
Even though it's hard, you're doing it. And people are watching, and you're not doing it for them.
No.
You're doing it for God
Yes.
and for your daughter. But they're watching, and they're learning. They're growing from seeing how you are working through this, how you are continuing to keep moving forward. Do you have a word of advice for people, whether it's grieving the loss of a loved one, or a health challenge, or divorce, or any number of zigzags? How do you keep moving forward?
I mean, it's a choice. Every day is a choice.
Yes.
And I think, I don't know why the word keeps coming up in my mind, but dig deep.
Does go along with the analogy.
Yes, it could be the soil. I don't know.
I don't know where that idea came from.
I don't know. But yeah, I mean, his truth is just so deeply rooted in my soul. And I just feel like that's where it comes from.
Amazing. Just absolutely amazing. And I'm glad we ventured off the course of mindset, strategy, and habits. Not that any of the interviews that I want to do have to be fitting in that box. But when we talked about what you wanted to share today, this deeper understanding didn't fit in that box.
Right.
But there's so much valuable information for any of us as we encounter any sort of zigzag, because we know they're going to happen.
Of course.
None of us are immune from facing the struggles in this life. We're promised that. I mean, Jesus told us that.
100%.
You're going to face trials of many kinds. And he wasn't kidding.
No, he was not.
But the idea of the seed dying and then producing a harvest that you mentioned that came from John 12:24 is something we can all learn from. And while the first part of the process, the seed being buried and having to die in order to grow and to produce a harvest and fruit or flowers, is something that we would like to relegate off to agriculture. It's part of the process that God has for us as well. And I appreciate so much, and thank you so much
Absolutely.
for sharing today. It has been a joy to spend time with you again. And we're going to end this show once more with you sending us off.
When life zigs and zags, keep moving forward.